I see you, and I honor the courage it takes to lead with the weight of an entire people on your shoulders." For a heartbeat, the words seemed to hang in the air, suspended like a spark before flame. The cameras caught at this sharp intake of breath, the sudden stillness in the room, and then, before anyone could process, President Ibrahim Traoré's face softened. His composure breaking as tears welled at the corners of his eyes. The world had not expected this. Not here, not from her. The chamber, usually buzzing with whispered side comments and casual smirks, fell silent. You could almost hear the pulse of history thudding beneath the floor. Members of Congress, diplomats, and reporters froze in their seats, realizing they were witnessing something raw, something unpolished yet undeniable. Narration cut in, the room froze. The U.S. political class had never seen anything like it, because it wasn't just the words themselves, it was the weight behind them. Spoken not as platitudes, not as diplomatic theater, but as a human truth carried with conviction. In that one line, Jasmine Crockett managed to pierce through the layers of cynicism, arrogance, and politics as usual. She didn't speak as someone climbing a ladder of power. She spoke as someone standing firmly on the ground of justice, staring eye to eye with a leader who knew too well what it meant to bear the hopes of his people. And just like that, the story shifted. Crockett, long mocked in D.C. as too fiery, too raw, too much, suddenly wasn't too much at all. She was exactly enough, enough to command the room, enough to move a president, enough to leave America stunned. But in that moment, few understood what had just happened. Was this a breakthrough, a challenge to the way politics was done? Or was it simply a fleeting spark destined to fade? No one knew yet. What they did know was this: a single sentence had cracked the mask of diplomacy, and from the fracture poured something undeniable truth. But to understand why this moment left a president in tears and a nation reeling, we have to go back. To grasp the magnitude of that moment, you have to see the storm that swirled around it. For months, U.S.-Africa relations had simmered with tension. On one side, Washington elites whispered about strategic partnerships, carefully worded press releases, and the usual rituals of diplomacy. On the other, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré spoke with fire, demanding respect, demanding sovereignty, demanding that Africa no longer be treated as an afterthought in a global order built to keep it in its place. In the middle of this fragile stage stood Jasmine Crockett, fresh, unapologetic, and unrefined by the calcified traditions of Capitol Hill. She hadn't been polished into silence. She hadn't learned to bite her tongue to soothe egos, and for that, she became a lightning rod. Cable news panels dismissed her as too bold. Pundits sneered that she lacked the decorum expected of a rising star. Some mocked her cadence, her hair, her accent, anything they could twist into a caricature. To them, she wasn't a stateswoman, she was a headline waiting to be ridiculed. A clip for late-night mockery. A gaffe machine. And yet, beneath the mockery was fear. Because what happens when the voice you dismiss at home begins to echo abroad, louder and clearer than all the scripted mites? What happens when the woman you try to shrink becomes the one commanding the world stage? The tension was electric. Crockett walked into every hearing, every forum, every podium with eyes on her not to learn, but to catch her stumble. Reporters sharpened their pens, ready to script her downfall. Meanwhile, her opponents in Congress painted her as reckless, uncivil, a dangerous symbol of politics unchained from the old order. And then there was Traoré, a young African president, already cast as the disruptor of the continent, a man seen by some as dangerous, by others as inspiring. He, too, carried the scars of ridicule. He, too, knew the sting of being underestimated, of being told he was not enough, or worse, that he was too much. Two figures, continents apart, bound by a shared defiance against arrogance, disguised as order. When their paths crossed, the collision was inevitable. But no one, either the pundits sharpening their knives, nor the politicians tightening their smirks, could have predicted what would happen when Crockett's unfiltered truth met Traoré's unflinching spirit. The stage was set. The critics waited to pounce. The world braced for a spectacle. The answer would ignite a chain reaction across continents. Before the world saw Jasmine Crockett's words break through the noise, there was a chorus determined to drown her out. Washington is no stranger to arrogance, but the disdain directed at Crockett carried an extra edge. It wasn't just about her politics, it was about who she was, how she looked, and the audacity of her very presence. From the moment she arrived on Capitol Hill, insiders rolled their eyes. Behind closed doors, staffers muttered that she was too aggressive, that she lacked polish, that she didn't know her place. The press picked up on the whispers and turned them into headlines. One columnist mocked her as a firebrand who burns bridges faster than she builds them. Another dismissed her speeches as performance politics, implying her words held no substance, only theater. And yet, these same voices, these same self-appointed gatekeepers of seriousness, never flinched when male colleagues bellowed, grandstanded, or delivered empty tirades. No, Crockett was singled out for a different reason, because she refused to shrink, because she didn't play their game. Her critics wore the mask of respectability, but underneath it was hypocrisy. They praised strength in politics when it came wrapped in bluster from those they already accepted into their club. They exalted passion when it poured from the lips of those who fit the mold. But when Crockett raised her voice, when she spoke with unapologetic clarity, that same strength was called anger. That same passion was labeled unprofessional. They underestimated her at every turn, convinced she would stumble, convinced her energy would consume her before she could ever land a real blow. They saw her as a curiosity, a sideshow, someone destined to flame out, and in their arrogance, they never noticed the careful way she studied the room, the way she listened, the way she built her words into weapons sharper than any insult hurled her way. Pundits, too, joined the chorus. Night after night, cable panels sneered at her presence. A single clip, stripped of context, would be replayed as evidence of her supposed unfitness. She's too raw, one talking head smirked. She doesn't have the temperament. Another chimed in, if the Democrats think this is the future, they're in trouble. But arrogance breeds blindness, and in mocking her, in dismissing her, they revealed their own weakness. They clung to the old order, terrified of a voice that could not be bought, that would not be quiet, that dared to make dignity a political weapon. The hypocrisy grew clearer with every passing week. These were the same voices who cheered American leaders for showing strength on the global stage, who applauded fiery rhetoric when it was aimed abroad. Yet, when that same steel emerged from Crockett's lips, when she dared to wield truth against corruption and contempt, suddenly strength was unbecoming. Suddenly fire was a flaw. It was a double standard rooted in arrogance, and it was meant to keep her contained, to keep her in the box they had built for her, to remind her, and anyone who looked like her, of where they were supposed to stand. In the pecking order, but Crockett had never played by their rules. She had never bowed to their expectations. And every sneer, every headline, every whisper of dismissal only sharpened her resolve. She knew what they could not admit, that their mockery was not proof of her weakness, but evidence of their fear. Fear that she could not be controlled. Fear that her words might resonate. Fear that she might become exactly what they claimed. She could never be a voice that shifts the ground beneath them. Washington's insiders thought they knew how the story would go. They thought they were writing her ending before it began. But they underestimated the power of someone who had lived her entire life being underestimated, and that mistake would cost them, because Crockett was no stranger to being underestimated. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin beneath the chandeliers of Washington. It began in Texas, in neighborhoods where opportunity was rationed. Voices like hers were rarely amplified. She wasn't born into privilege. She wasn't groomed for politics. Her fire was forged in the ordinary struggles of working families, where bills stacked up faster than paychecks, and justice often seemed like a word reserved for someone else. Long before she stood before cameras, she stood in courtrooms as a public defender, representing those who couldn't afford polished lawyers with expensive suits. She listened to the trembling voices of clients who had been told all their lives that the system wasn't for them. She stood beside them anyway. That was where she learned that justice wasn't about rhetoric, it was about showing up. It was about daring to stand next to those the world had written off and say, "I see you, that work left scars." Days when she lost cases, not because the truth wasn't clear, but because the deck was stacked. Nights when she lay awake, turning over the weight of injustice in her chest, asking how much one person could carry. But each disappointment hardened her resolve. Each loss made her sharper, quicker, unwilling to accept the polished lies of a system that had never been fair. Her path to Congress was no red carpet, it was a fight. She faced ridicule in her campaigns, opponents who painted her as angry, as unfit, as radical. But she also built a coalition of people who saw themselves in her: immigrants, workers, single mothers, students, all those who had been told to sit quietly and wait their turn. Her rise was not an accident. It was a demand from the people, who had been silenced for too long. And when she entered Congress, the same old forces tried to break her. They whispered about her behind closed doors, they nitpicked her tone, they smirked at her defiance. Yet, in every committee hearing, every floor speech, she carried her Texas grit into the belly of the political machine. She refused to dull her edges. She refused to trade her authenticity for acceptance. That refusal made her enemies, but it also made her unforgettable. People outside Washington, ordinary Americans watching from their living rooms, recognized something rare. Someone who wasn't playing dress up as a leader, but living it. Someone who understood the pain of being dismissed, the weight of being overlooked. Her journey carved a paradox: hated by insiders, loved by the people, mocked in headlines, admired in homes across the country. And it was that paradox that prepared her for what was coming, because when she stepped into that international forum, when she faced down the glares and smirks of critics waiting for her to falter, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was carrying every courtroom client who had been silenced. She was carrying every voter who had been told they didn't matter. She was carrying every scar the system had etched into her spirit. Jasmine Crockett was not simply a politician. She was a fighter forged in the fires of dismissal and ridicule. And it was those battles, bloody, bruising, humiliating at times, that had sharpened her into someone who could not be rattled. Someone who could stare into a room full of skeptics and hold her ground. Someone who could speak a single sentence and move a president to tears. The very experiences that Washington used to mock her harassment. Her refusal to filter herself, her unwillingness to conform would become the very armor she carried into that fateful moment. These scars became the armor she would wear in the moment that shook the world. The stage was set beneath the cool glow of chandeliers, the air thick with expectation and quiet suspicion. Delegates shifted in their seats, whispering behind folders and programs, their eyes darting between the U.S. delegation and the young African leader seated just rows away. Cameras clicked in bursts, hungry for the photo that might capture a misstep, a hesitation, a fracture in the facade of unity. Jasmine Crockett entered that room not as the seasoned diplomat others expected, but as herself, sharp, deliberate, unflinching. Every gaze seemed to weigh her, to measure whether she belonged. She knew what they were waiting for: the stumble, the gaffe, the quote they could twist into proof that she wasn't ready for the world stage. She carried that awareness like a second skin, but her steps didn't falter. The discussion began in the usual cadence of international forums: layered statements, carefully rehearsed lines, diplomatic hedges, the kind of language designed not to stir emotions, but to keep them sleeping. Yet, beneath the surface, there was tension. U.S. officials projected authority, but their words lacked conviction. Traoré's presence radiated something different: defiance, impatience with the old hierarchies, a demand for dignity. When Crockett's turn came, the murmurs grew louder. Some leaned back in their chairs, prepared to be entertained more than persuaded. Others crossed their arms, bracing for the fire they thought they knew. She paused, surveying the room with a composure that unnerved her doubters. Then she began, not with anger, not with a raised voice, but with calm precision. Her words sliced through the stale air. She didn't drown the room with volume. She commanded it with clarity. Each phrase struck clean, stripped of the diplomatic varnish that insulated so many speeches from truth. Its reaction was immediate. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others scoffed, exchanging glances as if to say, "There it is, too raw, too direct." One critic rolled his eyes theatrically, a gesture caught perfectly by the cameras, but Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned into their contempt, letting it sharpen her cadence rather than shake it. Traoré watched intently, his expression unreadable, but his focus unwavering. Unlike the others, he didn't smirk, didn't dismiss. He recognized something in her tone, something familiar, the grit of someone who had been underestimated too. Many times to count, as she pressed forward, the tension built. Her detractors tried to puncture the moment with interruptions, subtle sighs, even whispered side comments meant to throw her off. Still, she moved forward, every sentence steady, every pause deliberate. The arrogance in the room began to crack. What was meant to be a performance of her weakness was quickly becoming a performance of their fragility. The air grew taut, as though the room itself sensed what was coming. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Delegates stopped scribbling notes. Even the skeptics who had entered certain of her failure found themselves unable to look away. And then, without warning, the moment arrived. Crockett slowed, her eyes scanning the room, her voice softening as if preparing to lower a weight heavy enough to shake the floor beneath her. Then came the sentence, the one line that changed everything. The pause before it landed felt eternal. Crockett drew in a breath, steady and deliberate, her gaze moving across the room as though she were weighing each soul present. The murmurs had died down. Even the loudest skeptics sat in uneasy silence, sensing something imminent. And then, in a tone calm yet charged with unshakable conviction, she delivered the sentence, "I see you, and I honor the courage it takes to lead with the weight of an entire people on your shoulders." For a split second, there was nothing, no applause, no reaction, only stunned stillness. The words had slipped past the armor of political theater and cut directly into the heart of the moment. They weren't draped in policy jargon or puffed-up slogans. They were human, and that humanity hit like a lightning strike. Across the room, President Ibrahim Traoré shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, his eyes glistened, and then, unmistakably his composure broke. A single tear welled before tracing the path down his cheek. The young president, who had stared down colonizers and critics alike with the resolve of stone, was undone not by power, not by flattery, but by recognition, by dignity, by being seen. The cameras caught it instantly. Flashes erupted as journalists scrambled, realizing they were capturing history. The image of Traoré S-tier, shimmering under the lights, would soon travel across the globe. But inside that chamber, the atmosphere was electric, alive with disbelief. Those who had mocked Crockett before now sat frozen. Their smirks had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that something monumental had just occurred and they hadn't seen it coming. One opponent, who had rolled his eyes moments earlier, now looked away, avoiding the cameras, his arrogance dissolving into awkward silence. And still, Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence breathe, let the weight of her words expand. She leaned into the pause, confident enough to let the moment speak louder than anything she could add. The room was hers, and she knew it. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Delegates whispered among themselves, some visibly shaken. And in the middle of it all, Traoré raised a hand to his face, brushing at the tears as if to reclaim his composure. But the damage, or perhaps the miracle, was already done. The image of him weeping was indelible. Not a sign of weakness, but of something far more powerful. Vulnerability embraced in front of the world. Crockett pressed on, her voice unwavering. She framed her words not as a lecture, but as a bridge, weaving together the shared struggles of oppressed people across oceans. She invoked the dignity of immigrants who had carried entire families on their backs, of communities overlooked and underestimated, of leaders who bore impossible weight with no thanks and no mercy. Each word built upon the sentence, but nothing outshone it. That one line had already carved its place in memory. For the first time, those who had dismissed her as Traoré could not deny her command. They had waited for her to unravel, but it was they who were unraveling under the pressure of their own arrogance. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't shouted anyone down. She had simply spoken with a clarity and sincerity they couldn't manufacture, and the truth of it was undeniable. The moment rippled outward. Traoré visibly moved, leaned forward, nodding slowly, his entire demeanor softened. Around him, allies and rivals alike glanced at one another, struggling to process. The sight of a man who had faced down tanks and dictators, now brought to tears by the words of an American Congresswoman. For Crockett, it wasn't victory in the traditional sense. She hadn't scored a debate point or landed a rehearsed zinger for the evening news. She had revealed something deeper, that politics didn't always need to be performance, that sometimes it could still be human, and that humanity, in its rawest form, could topple arrogance more effectively than any insult ever could. The crowd reaction began as a murmur. Then applause scattered, hesitant at first, as though people weren't sure whether to break the spell. But once it started, it spread like fire. Soon, the room erupted, the applause thundering, echoing off, the chamber walls swelling until it drowned out the last remnants of doubt. Some rose to their feet, clapping with eyes fixed not on Crockett's critics, but on her. For those watching across the globe, the feed captured it all: the stillness, the sentence, the tear, the eruption of applause. Within minutes, clips would be spliced, hashtags born, headlines drafted, but none of those could fully convey the electricity in the room, the sense that something larger than politics had just broken through. And still, amid the storm of attention, Crockett held steady. She didn't bask, she didn't gloat, she let the applause roll over her like a tide, her eyes fixed calmly ahead. For all the noise, she knew the real impact was not in the cheers, but in the silence that had followed her words. The silence when hearts had recognized something they hadn't heard in too long, truth spoken plainly. Her critics would scramble. Later, fumbling for explanations, some would insist it was staged, that Traoré's tears were theater. Others would cling to the claim that her words meant little in the grand scheme of policy. But in that moment, none of them had dared to speak. Their silence was its own confession. Because for once, dignity had triumphed over arrogance. Humanity had broken through the performance. And all of Washington knew it. But what happened next left even Crockett herself unprepared. The clip hit the internet before Crockett even left the chamber. One shaky phone recording, then another. Then the high-definition feed-all, capturing the same unforgettable sequence. The sentence, the silence, the tear. Within minutes, hashtags lit up across platforms. Crockett moment, Zine Hall Traoré tears. Hashtag dignity. On TikTok, users looped the moment, slowing the footage to highlight the exact second Traoré's composure gave way. Edits poured in Crockett's voice overlaid with swelling violins, her words stitched into montages of protests, immigrants at airports, young people chanting in the streets. On Twitter, journalists scrambled to contextualize it. Did Jasmine Crockett just redefine America's voice abroad? Commentators argued over whether it was history in the making or just political theater. But the sheer volume of attention made the question irrelevant. The moment had already transcended debate. Late-night shows replayed the clip with astonishment. One host leaned forward, eyes wide. When was the last time you saw a U.S. politician move another head of state to tears of respect, not frustration? I'll wait, the audience roared. Celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians, actors, activists each, reposting the line, each framing it as proof that authenticity could still break through the noise. Even politicians who had mocked Crockett before struggled to find footing. Some remained silent, hoping the storm would pass. Others attempted to pivot, praising the importance of dialogue, carefully sidestepping any acknowledgement of their own dismissals. A few, sensing the shift in public sentiment, scrambled to align themselves with her, tweeting out thinly veiled congratulations while their past criticisms lingered just a Google search away. Meanwhile, in living rooms and classrooms, the impact was visceral. Immigrant families replayed the clip, parents nodding, children sitting taller as if those words had been spoken directly to them. I see you, and I honor the courage. For people who had spent lifetimes feeling unseen, unheard, those words echoed like validation long overdue. Teachers pulled it up in civics lessons. Pastors referenced it in sermons. On college campuses, students debated what it meant for America's role in the world. The ripple effects reached beyond the U.S. In Burkina Faso, crowds gathered in cafes to watch the clip on phones, cheering as they saw their president's vulnerability framed not as weakness but as humanity. African newspapers ran headlines, hailing the exchange as a rare moment of mutual respect between continents too often caught in a hierarchy of condescension. Commentators praised Crockett for breaking the mold of American arrogance with something radical, humility and recognition. And yet, beneath the praise, there was unease. Washington's insiders were rattled. This was not how the script was supposed. To go, Crockett wasn't meant to overshadow the delegation, wasn't meant to become the story. But she had not through scandal or gaffe, but through a moment of grace that their cynicism had not accounted for. They scrambled to reassert control. Op-eds appeared, warning against emotional politics, dismissing tears as irrelevant to policy. Cable news panels debated whether respectful language could really shape global power, but every attempt to downplay the moment only underscored its resonance. Because for millions watching, this wasn't about policy papers. It was about dignity. It was about finally seeing someone who didn't just speak at the world, but to it. For Crockett, the shockwaves were immediate and disorienting. Overnight, her inbox flooded with messages of gratitude, stories from people who felt seen for the first time by an American politician. Constituents back home called her office in tears. Activists reached out to say her words had lit a fire they thought had gone out. She had entered the chamber expecting ridicule. Instead, but the truest measure of that moment was not in headlines, but in hearts. The noise of the headlines eventually faded, as all headlines do. Hashtags lost their fire. News cycles spun forward. But the essence of what Jasmine Crockett had unleashed did not vanish. It lingered in conversations around dinner tables, in classrooms where young people debated what leadership could mean, in churches and mosques where spiritual leaders invoked her words as examples of dignity in action. For weeks after, Crockett was asked the same question. Did she plan that line? Was it scripted? Was it a strategic move to steal the spotlight? Each time, she shook her head. It wasn't strategy, it was humanity, and therein lay the lesson. In a world addicted to spectacle, one unscripted sentence reminded people that authenticity could be revolutionary. She reframed the confrontation not as a clash of egos, but as a universal moment of truth, that the courage to lead, to shoulder the weight of a people, deserves to be seen and honored, regardless of borders, regardless of politics. Her detractors had tried to weaponize her rawness against her. But that very quality, the refusal to sand herself down into palatable soundbites, had become her greatest strength. It was a reminder that empathy is not weakness, that recognition is not surrender, that dignity will always carry more power than arrogance. And it was a reminder that America's greatness is not measured in military parades or chest-thumping speeches, but in the ability of its representatives to see the humanity in others and speak to it with honesty. For those who had been told they were too much, too loud, too visible, Crockett's words became a mirror reflecting back their worth. For those who had been told they were invisible, her sentence was proof that invisibility could be shattered in a single breath. And for those who believed politics had lost its soul, the moment was a defiant declaration. The soul still exists, if we are brave enough to claim it. She had faced arrogance and responded with dignity. She had been dismissed as unfit and answered with a truth so undeniable it moved a president to tears. That was not just a personal victory, it was a moral reckoning. In the end, the lesson was simple yet profound. Politics stripped of humanity collapses into theater. But politics rooted in dignity can still inspire, still unite, still remind us of what we share. Crockett's one sentence, born from conviction rather than calculation, became proof of that. And if one sentence can move a president to tears, imagine what a generation can do together. The sentence that made a president cry has already begun to make America listen. In a city where noise is constant and sincerity is rare, Jasmine Crockett showed the world that clarity and courage can still break through. She didn't need to shout over her critics. She didn't need to posture or play act strength. She simply spoke from a place of truth, and the result was a moment that rippled across continents. That is why this story matters. Because it wasn't just about a U.S. representative and an African president. It was about the universal hunger to be seen. It was about the power of words to pierce through cynicism, to remind us that politics can still be human. Crockett proved that dignity can silence arrogance, that empathy can outshine contempt, that even in the halls of power, vulnerability can be a form of strength. For those watching at home, the challenge is simple. Don't let this moment fade into just another clip. Carry it, share it. Let it remind you of your own worth, your own voice, your own power to speak truth when it matters most. Because if one sentence can bring a president to tears, your voice can stir change in your community, your city, your nation. So here is the call. Subscribe, share, and stay with us. Be part of this movement that insists politics is more than theater, that insists humanity belongs at the center of power. Let this moment echo, not as a single tear on a single face, but as a spark that ignites countless others. Never let your voice be silenced, because the world is always listening, waiting for the next sentence that can change everything. When you like this video, you're not just clicking a button, you're amplifying a voice that too many tried to silence. And when you share it, you're planting seeds in conversations across families, campuses, and communities that need to hear. This story, think about it. One sentence moved a president to tears. Imagine what millions of us, connected and determined, could do together. Imagine the movements we could ignite, the arrogance we could shatter, the dignity we could elevate. So don't watch and walk away. Subscribe, like, share, become part of this moment. Because the fight for empathy, for justice, for humanity itself isn't over, it's only beginning. And your voice matters more than you know. The world is listening. Let's make sure it hears us.